Now, as you can see, our title of our topic is Physics Disproves Atheistic Cosmologies. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, let's take it one step at a time. Physics has been called the queen of the sciences. If you think about it, it's really the most fundamental, foundational of the sciences. I mean, every other science, in a sense, is how physics works itself out in a specific area, right? So astronomy is how the laws of physics work themselves out in the heavens. Chemistry is how the laws of physics are worked out in matter. Biology is how the laws of physics are worked out in life, right? And on it goes. So physics, again, very, very fundamental to science, very foundational. And I'm going to argue that physics disproves any sort of an atheistic cosmology. What do I mean by disproves? Well, here I'm going to say that physics, by its very nature, is incompatible with the idea that there is no God. And this is more than just saying that physics supports the idea of an intelligent designer, which it does. But it goes so far with that you're not allowed to escape the God conclusion by invoking, for example, aliens having created us, which is what some atheists try to do. Because when you really look at this issue, physics discredits a non-creationary origins of things so thoroughly and in its very nature that any kind of substitute you want to put in there for God ultimately has to have all the attributes of God anyway. So you can't claim that an alien created everything, for example, because an alien is still going to be limited in that it inhabits this physical universe. And as I'm going to argue tonight, physics shows that the Creator did not do that. He's outside of space and time. I've also used the word atheist and atheism. What do I mean by that? Well, atheism just comes from the Greek atheos, meaning no God. So atheism is the idea that there is no God. And atheists, in case you haven't noticed, which I'm sure you all have, are getting more vocal in our society today. And they're making a lot of claims that they didn't used to make before. And I say this as a former atheist myself. I was an atheist till I was almost 30 years old, specifically because of what I thought science had to say about origins. And it wasn't until working as an engineer later in my career, wound up working with a Christian coworker who confronted me on my atheism and my evolutionism, pointed out, among other things, that worldview is incompatible with many things we were doing there in that career, being military space program. And I eventually became a believer as a result of that. And so therefore, this is of great interest to me personally. But my point is, back then, we didn't so much identify as atheists as we did other things. Back then, most atheists would tell you they were secular humanists. They were less interested in being against God and perhaps more interested in being for something positive, like the idea that humanity would rise itself up, pull itself up by its bootstraps technologically and all the rest of it. Whereas today you don't hear that from the atheists. Today the atheists are very vocal about it being all about anti-God and not really being about being for much of anything. And Richard Dawkins, for example, as I'm sure you've heard that name, has some presence on the web, of course, and I like showing this because the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science. Atheists like to claim that reason and science are on their side, that any reasonable person who could look at the evidence objectively without being blinded by their faith, for example, would certainly reach the conclusion that there is no God, contrary to what we in this room would advocate. Professor Dawkins said, sincere people can be cruelly torn almost in two between the massive evidence of science on the one hand and their understanding of what their holy book tells them on the other. I think this is one of the truly bad things that religion can do to a human mind. So again, you see the contrast here. There's massive evidence of science on the one hand and the holy book, i.e. the Bible, for example, on the other hand, and he's putting them in stark contrast to each other, right? He's saying you can't believe in both. Well, as we'll see tonight, that's not true. But he's not alone in making claims like this, nor is he alone in his militancy about how strongly he pushes this idea. Lawrence Krauss, who's a physicist and cosmologist and also an ardent atheist, wrote this article here, All Scientists Should Be Militant Atheists. And just by the very title, you can see that he believes that science and atheism are compatible. Well, we'll see if that's true. Now, the last part of our title that we haven't discussed yet is the word cosmology. What does cosmology mean? Well, cosmology is literally just the study of the cosmos, the study of the universe that we live in. And you often hear it applied to something like the Big Bang, which, strictly speaking, isn't actually an accurate way to do it. The study of the history of the universe would more correctly be called a cosmogony rather than a cosmology. But since most people in our society make that mistake, I think it's acceptable to do that just to be able to communicate with people. In our time here this evening, though, I'm going beyond just saying that we're disproving an atheistic cosmogony. I'm saying we're actually disproving an atheistic cosmology as well. It's not merely that the atheists have the origin of the universe wrong. They really have no right to expect to be able to study the universe in the first place, if they're going to think and act like atheists. So the most popular atheistic cosmology today is, of course, the Big Bang model. This graphic here is taken from the NASA website, and I'm sure you can find many other similar things. This presentation tonight isn't specifically about the Big Bang model itself. It's actually a broader thing, but we will be touching quite a bit on what the Big Bang has to say, as it is the most popular model today. And I also want to make the point before we launch into this, scientific evidence is very important in the creation-evolution discussion, isn't it? I mean, a lot of creation talks, like for example, I'm sure the one next month, will present a lot of evidences against the evolutionary idea of origins. And I'm not disagreeing that evidence is important, but I am saying it's not merely about the evidence. Like, for example, we are told that our solar system came from a big cloud of gas and dust that looks something like this. And that gas and dust condensed until it made a bunch of little rocks, which stuck together to become bigger rocks, which stuck together to become bigger rocks still, until eventually you had some asteroids called planetesimals that then stuck together and became planets in one way or the other. What happens when we apply physics to a model like this? I mean, if you see the Cosmos TV program or science media or science magazines or whatever, you'll be told that some variation of that model is where all the planets in our solar system came from. Well, the minor detail with that model is physics says it doesn't work that way, that it can't work that way. What do I mean by that? Well, let's think about some of the basic things in physics, like the laws of physics or the forces of physics. Gravity is something that we're all familiar with, right? Gravity is at play here and actually shows us that this model doesn't work. Why is that? Because you have little rocks flying around in the burgeoning solar system, banging together and supposedly growing into bigger ones. Well, we know from gravity that gravity is very weak, it's a very weak force, until there's a lot of mass in this system to produce a stronger gravitational force. And while these rocks are still small, there's not enough stuff there to produce much in the terms of gravity. However, they are big enough when they're about yay big, give it a meter size, give or take. They are big enough to start having destructive impact on each other when they hit. You know, little pebbles hitting each other, not a big deal. Boulders yay big smashing together at hundreds of thousands of miles an hour, well, that's a much more significant thing. And the solar system specifically cannot have come from this cloud of gas and dust because it can't make planetesimals, because the rocks can't get bigger than about this big. And of course, the planet we live on, among others, is much bigger than that. So, physics would discredit this atheistic origins model then, wouldn't it? And I'm not alone in saying this. Here's a quote from one of my astrophysics textbooks. Once these planetesimals have been formed, further growth of planets may occur through their gravitational accretion, their gathering together, into larger bodies, but just how that takes place is not understood. This author says the formation of planetesimals, the kilometer-sized planetary precursors, is still a puzzling process. And by the way, I'll be quoting atheists tonight for the most part. I'm not quoting creationists here. These are their own words. How the first stage of this process, primary accretion, works is a fundamental unsolved problem of planetary science. So how, if you're a secular astronomer then, wanting to believe that everything formed without a God being involved, how do you get around this problem? Well, the current favored solution is that objects went from rocks this big into rocks 100 kilometers or so across, asteroids, in a single leap. As this author says, objects must have grown very rapidly from sub-meter-sized pebbles into 100-kilometer-sized bodies in a single leap. For perspective, we're talking rocks this big turn into rocks the size of Rhode Island without passing through anything in between, any sizes in between. Is this a scientific model? Does physics allow for such a thing? I mean, you don't need to understand physics to understand that there's a big problem here, right? Now, I have a whole presentation on the formation of the solar system that goes planet by planet and actually shows how each one discredits the secular origins model in a different way. That's not our purpose tonight, but I will follow up just a little bit with the same idea that physics presents very fundamental challenges to these secular origins models. For example, we see the gas giant planets in the solar system. This is how they appear in terms of scale to each other. Of course, they're much further away from each other than this, but you can see how the Earth is compared to all of these planets. They're all very large. Well, to build planets this big, you need a lot of stuff, don't you? But again, you don't have the building blocks to make them according to the secular models when you apply physics to them. As this author says, how this process continues from meter-sized boulders to kilometer-scale planetesimals is a major unsolved problem. Boulders are expected to stick together poorly. That's what I just told you about. And then here's a second problem I didn't tell you about. And to spiral into the protostar, that would be the sun that's forming, in a few hundred orbits, owing to a headwind from the slower rotating gas. So let's talk about physics again. If you're swimming in a swimming pool and the water could somehow be replaced with molasses, would that speed you down or slow you up? Slow you down, of course. Did I say speed you down or slow you up? Excuse me. Slow you down or speed you up. Of course it would slow down. Well, this works the same way. If you have rocks, yay big, maybe somewhere around that size, orbiting through this cloud of gas and dust, it's sort of like plowing through molasses, or like this quote says, plowing through a headwind. That will slow the rocks down. And the way physics shows us the way orbits work, in an orbit, when you slow down, you move toward the object you're orbiting. And it's not too difficult in these models to show that these objects would, as the quote says, in just a few hundred orbits, that's just a few hundred years, which astronomically is a very short time, right, would spiral all the way in until they crashed into the sun. So we see planets that are this big. I mean, some enormous planets here. You need a lot of stuff to make these things. But the models show, as theories predict, that the giant protoplanets will merge into the central star before planets have time to form. This makes it very difficult to understand how they can form at all. Understanding the formation of giant planets is currently one of the major challenges for astronomers. Now, I'm offering a perspective here that you're not going to hear from the science media and so on, because those programs and magazines and all the rest of it tell you that it's all figured out, right? Yeah, billions of years ago, this gas did whatever, and then here we are. Isn't that how it's usually presented to us? But when you really dig into these models and how the physics works itself out, this is what you see instead. You see planets, but the planet shouldn't be there because the models say they couldn't have formed. Yet there they are, despite that. Moving onwards, outside of the solar system, we see a lot of stars in the universe, don't we? Well, if you want to have a secular model of origins, you not only have to explain, of course, our solar system, you have to explain the rest of the contents of the cosmos as well. And a really good question is, where do stars come from? Well, I, again, have a separate presentation just on this topic showing that star formation is prevented by some well-understood ideas in physics as well. And I'll just quote a couple secular authors here to make that point. This one says, the process by which an interstellar cloud is concentrated until it's held together gravitationally to become a protostar, a new star, is not known. The origin of stars represents one of the most fundamental unsolved problems of contemporary astrophysics. Nobody really understands how star formation proceeds. It's really remarkable. The universe we see when we look out to its furthest horizons contains 100 billion galaxies. Each of these galaxies contains another 100 billion stars, which is 10 to the 22 stars all told. So write a 1 with 22 zeros after it. That's how many stars we're talking about. The silent embarrassment of modern astrophysics is that we do not know how even a single one of these stars managed to form. And again, I'm not going into detail in this case about why the physics says this, but I hope you understand the point. These authors are admitting that there's some basic challenges that physics poses to these atheistic origins models. The formation of stars is one of the most fundamental problems in astrophysics. No current model can reproduce all the observations. Literally hundreds of ideas on how stars are formed have been advanced in past decades. However, we are still far from any real solution. And of course, if your model can't make stars, and it can't make galaxies either, because galaxies are just collections of billions of stars, plus some dust and a little bit of other stuff, but mostly stars, which is why some secular authors say things like this: the formation of galaxies and larger scale structure remains TMIUPIMA, the most important unsolved problem in modern astrophysics. There's something badly wrong with our standard picture of the origin of galaxies, and on it goes. Again, I have a whole presentation just on this topic alone. A lot of fun, but outside of our scope tonight. For now, let's move on and talk less about astronomy for a little bit and talk about other sciences. I've shown that physics poses some serious challenges, discredits an atheistic origins model for the universe at least. What about other areas of science? Well, Harvard University a few years back put out this video here called The Inner Life of a Cell. And of course, Harvard University is hardly a bastion of creationism, right? This shows some of the things that go on inside of your body when a white blood cell seeks out inflammation to go fight. And I know I've shown this video at a previous presentation. Chris might have as well, so I'm not going to show this whole thing. But just to show how intricate and how well designed all of these things are inside our bodies. Now, we're looking at the insides of just one cell. I mean, the complexity of biochemistry overall is a whole subject in itself. For now, I'd just like to make the point that the sophistication and, dare I say, engineering principles that we see in the structure of the cell are amazing, and the processes as well. The cell actually builds its internal structures as needed from proteins, and it's very frugal in how it does this. It causes structures to be built when needed, and then disassembles them when they're not needed, so the building blocks can be used elsewhere to form other structures of different kinds, and then those structures also can be disassembled and the pieces reused. It's amazing what goes on here. This is a motor protein bringing a vacuole of material up to the outer membrane. And this little guy is real. I mean, he's inside your cells right now, carrying things around. In fact, everything you see in this video is real. The only thing the animators did was move stuff a little bit further apart so we could see better what's going on. And I don't want to show you this whole video. If you'd like to see it for yourself, come talk to me afterward. I'll show you how to find it on YouTube. My point now is there's amazing design principles at play here, again discrediting the idea that this all formed all by itself. What about some other areas of science? Well, geology is a good one to talk about. I know in previous presentations here at the Apologetics Forum, people have spoken about carbon dating and radiometric dating in general, and how these processes work and supposedly can ascertain the age of something, but if you really grant the assumptions here, you don't actually wind up with the atheistic origins being supported. In this example here, I'm pointing out that there's carbon-14 found in a lot of things that are supposed to be old, supposed to be millions of years old. The problem is carbon-14 decays very quickly and would be gone in less than 100,000 years. So if you find carbon-14 in a geological sample or paleontological sample, it means that that object is less than 100,000 years old. In fact, probably much less younger than that, because it gets very difficult to even detect it anyway for technological reasons once it's above 5 or 10,000. So when we find something that is claimed to be millions of years old, like petrified wood, for example, but you take a sample of it and send it to a carbon-14 laboratory and they'll tell you it has measurable carbon-14 still within it, that tells you that's only thousands of years old, not actually millions. Coal, same thing. Secular scientists will tell you millions of years ago is when all this stuff formed, but it has measurable carbon-14 still within it, therefore it can only be thousands of years old. Oil, same thing, not millions, just thousands. Now to this point, secular scientists have said, well, these carbon-14 measurements are just the result of contamination in the samples. Well, that objection went away when carbon-14 was discovered inside of diamonds, which are supposed to be over 1 billion years old, by the way. But diamonds, of course, being as hard as they are, you can't get contamination to come in from the outside. So again, something that's supposed to be very old actually looks very young. We could talk about dinosaurs. In fact, I believe Chris has a talk on that coming up, which I would recommend you all attend if you aren't familiar with this topic. If you aren't familiar with this topic, you probably know that they've discovered soft tissue in dinosaur bones, like this here. This is from the inside of a tyrannosaur thigh bone, soft, stretchy tissue. Looks like beef jerky almost. Is that 65 million years old? Or is it much younger than that? Within that tissue, we find blood vessels and blood cells. Dinosaur blood we are finding in these fossils. And this isn't a unique thing. Now that such discoveries have been made, other people are looking further. We're finding evidence of bone proteins in fossils that are supposed to be 65 million years old. But bone proteins don't last that long. They're very fragile and would go away very quickly. Here's another scientific paper talking about soft sheets of tissue being found in a triceratops horn. There's evidence of DNA in some dinosaur samples. Well, we know, again, from physics, that DNA, for biochemical reasons, actually breaks down very quickly, even if you freeze it and seal it off from oxygen. In fact, this one study said, even when you freeze it and seal it off, The model says that no intact DNA bonds will remain in DNA after just 6.5 million years. Dinosaurs are supposed to be 65 million years old at a minimum, which is 10 times longer than that, but there's evidence of DNA within them. Again, discrediting the evolutionary models. Then we could talk about genetics if we wanted. There's evidence from genetics supporting biblical creation. And this is a bit off my topic tonight, but come talk to me afterward if you want to hear about that. The reason I'm bringing all this stuff up now, and I know I just threw a lot of stuff at you in a short time, is to make the point that everything I just talked about, the secular scientists are fully aware of. Right? I mean, I quoted a bunch of them in the astronomy section, right? That shows you that this whole thing isn't just about the evidence, is it? It's actually about the worldview. It's about the way that you look at the evidence and the assumptions you bring to the table when you look at that evidence and try to interpret it. So your worldview is kind of like a set of glasses that you put on that you can never take off. We are all familiar with the idea that if you put on glasses, everything looks dark, right? Sunglasses, rather. A worldview is like a pair of sunglasses you can never take off. It always affects how you view the world. And the example I like to give at this one is the old, kind of cliched magic trick where the magician shows you the inside of a hat, that it's empty, and then he pulls out a rabbit from it. Now, do you believe he actually pulled a rabbit out of a hat? Do you believe he made a rabbit out of nothing? And obviously not. I assume everybody would say no. So why do you not believe that he created a rabbit out of nothing? Because your worldview tells you that such a thing is impossible. So think about how powerful your worldview is. You will disbelieve your own eyes. You saw that hat was empty, right? You'll disbelieve your own eyes before you question your worldview. So a lot of times when we're discussing about atheistic origins models, both sides in the discussion, creationists and evolutionists, have the same evidence, don't we? But we reach different conclusions. Why is that? Because we're using different worldviews to interpret it. The creationist sees astronomy and says the heavens declare the glory of God. Look at all these amazing things. The evolutionist says, well, look what gas does when you leave it sit there by itself for billions of years. The creationist sees evidence for design in biology. The atheist and evolutionist see evidence for Darwinian processes. The creationist sees carbon-14 in objects that are claimed to be old. The atheist says, well, I guess those samples are contaminated. The creationist says, look, dinosaur blood can't be thousands of years old. Evolutionist says, well, apparently dinosaur blood can last millions of years after all. Genetics, similar arguments. It seems then that both sides are kind of butting heads, right? That we each have our different worldview, and so we're not going to be able to communicate very well. But that's actually not true because the creationist theist worldview is far superior to the atheist worldview. And that'll be the rest of our presentation here this evening. See, because evidence is important, and I just shared some of that with you, but we're going to talk about something more deeper than just evidence, because when you talk about evidence with someone, it's the conflicting worldview issue, right? You look at it one way, they look at it another way. They're making assumptions that prevent them from acknowledging that what you're saying is true. If you talk about physics with an atheist, though, well, that's something more fundamental than just little pieces of evidence, isn't it? So here's an approach I like to take with this. The Bible says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Hopefully we're all familiar with that verse. Now, the fool says in his heart that there is no God, right? So if you say there is no God, then that means you don't have the fear of the Lord, which means you have set aside, you have denied the beginning of wisdom, the foundation of wisdom. Therefore, if you start out by denying the foundation of wisdom, if you start out by denying that which is truth, then wherever it is you wind up is going to be falsehood of one variety or another, right? It's going to be, as this verse says, folly, foolishness. So applying that to cosmology specifically, which is our topic this evening, the rest of our presentation, I will be arguing that an atheistic approach to cosmology, when done consistently, which no atheist actually does, but if the atheists were to be consistent, they would wind up requiring, or at least acknowledging, that their model requires violation of some fundamental physics, ultimately a denial that laws of physics are even valid things anyway, and if they really want to be consistent and go all the way with their worldview, they ultimately have to deny that the universe even exists. And that's going on beyond saying they can't explain why it exists. They actively have to deny that it exists if they're going to be consistent atheists, which again, none of them are. So let's talk about the first one of these, An atheistic approach to cosmology violates some fundamental physics. First of all, let me say that the biblical worldview actually affirms physics. As the Bible says, "Thus says the Lord who gives the sun for a light by day and the fixed order of the moon and the stars for light by night." Christ upholds all things by the word of his power, and there's several other verses I could quote here. The Bible talks about the creation operating according to consistent patterns, that's how the Lord made it. He made it to do so. So, as Christians, we can affirm that it does. The cosmos operates according to consistent principles. It's our joy and privilege to go discover those through science. So a Christian physicist can affirm that laws of physics are real things and that the universe operates according to some, and that we can go try to figure them out. Atheists, however, don't have that foundation, of course, since they don't believe in the Bible, so they have to try to come up with a different justification for believing in the laws of physics. Well, let's see how that works out. First of all, let's say that the universe exists. Now, later I'll show that atheism says it doesn't anyway, but for now, let's all agree that it does, and ask a question. Did this universe have a beginning? Well, there's two possible answers to that, yes and no, right? Let's look at the answer no first. If the universe did not have a beginning, that would mean it is eternal, right? Because that's what no beginning means. If it never began, it's always been there, thus it's eternal, and thus it's existed forever. However, if you think about it, we can show that the universe hasn't existed forever. How do we do that? Well, we do that because a universe that existed forever would violate the second law of thermodynamics, at least the one that we see would. What do I mean by that? Well, if you take a cup of coffee, hot coffee specifically, and leave it on a counter somewhere and don't drink it, what's going to happen to it? Assuming no one else drinks it. The coffee will eventually cool off, right? Why does it do that? Well, because hot things release their energy into the surrounding environment until the room temperature goes up a little bit, the temperature in the cup goes down until they meet, and then everything is the same temperature at that point. That's one result of the second law of thermodynamics. You may have heard it expressed as entropy will always increase. Well, coffee is a good example of that. There's many other examples as well. Anything that's hot will eventually cool off. All batteries will eventually discharge. Subnuclear particles will eventually decay. On and on it goes. Now, here's a question. Let's think of the universe overall, since we're talking about cosmology. Is there anything in the universe that hasn't cooled off yet? Stars, right? Now, if the universe were eternal, how much time would there have been for stars to cool off? In eternity, forever, right? But they haven't cooled off yet. So that tells us there hasn't been forever yet, which means there had to have been a beginning, because stars are still there. Now, some would say, wait a minute, yeah, the stars we see haven't cooled off yet, but you can make new ones, so you can just keep replacing them. Well, that idea has problems too, as I talk about in my star presentation. For now, let's agree that stars can form, though. Star formation itself, though, still requires energy. And the whole idea behind thermodynamics is your usable energy always gets used up eventually until there's none left. So star formation eventually will also cease. So if stars can no longer form and the ones that are already there cool off and they're not stars anymore, then eventually, if the universe were eternal, we wouldn't see stars. But of course we do. In fact, more things than just stars will cool off. Some physicists have asked the question, what happens if the universe keeps going forever? Well, obviously all stars will cool off. Everything that's radioactive will eventually decay until it's not radioactive anymore. All the various sources of energy in the universe will eventually dissipate until the universe, the entire universe, is a few degrees above absolute zero, and all life stops because there's no available energy for life to sustain itself. What happens after that? Wait billions or even trillions of years after that. Well, various particles, according to some ideas in physics, would decay also. So it's possible that if you wait long enough, the universe would eventually turn not merely into an ice-cold universe where nothing is alive, but a universe in which there's very little matter left of any sort. Just a bunch of radiation. Big cosmos full of radiation would be it. Pretty cheerful fate awaits atheists, right? Of course, we know the Lord's coming back, and that's not going to happen. My point for now is, though, if the universe were eternally old, we would see some scenario like that have happened. Since we have not seen it happen, since there's still energy in the universe for us to use and observe, that means the universe had a beginning. And by the way, a lot of Christians endorse the Big Bang model because they think we need the Big Bang to explain the beginning of the universe, and that's concordant with Genesis, right? Or so they say. Well, we don't actually need the Big Bang model to prove the universe had a beginning. All you need to do is go out at night and look up at the sky. Do you see stars? Or would you see stars if you didn't live in Seattle? If so, that tells you the universe had a beginning. We don't need the Big Bang model for that. So the idea that the universe did not have a beginning doesn't work because of some basic physics. That means the other option has to be true, which is that the universe did have a beginning. Now, as Christians, this, of course, doesn't surprise us because the Bible says that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And indeed, this idea is fairly non-controversial so far. Most atheists, most secular astronomers would agree that the universe did have a beginning. Of course, they wouldn't say God did it. So let's say the universe began. Okay. What existed, though, before the universe began? Well, again, you have two choices. There was something or there was nothing. If there was something before the universe began, then you really haven't answered the question then, have you? Where did the something come from? Did it have a beginning, and was there something before it? And you keep asking that question until you either have to say it's eternal all the way back, which we just saw doesn't work, or at one point there had to be nothing. I'm getting ahead of myself here. If you agree, okay, I'll explain these slides briefly. Sometimes people say, yes, there was something before the universe. They'll try to invoke a multiverse with infinite universes, or maybe brain universes, where brain stands for membrane. Our universe is just one of an infinite number of these brains that are all colliding in space, and each collision represents a new bang, blah, blah, blah. You see, though, this isn't actually answering the question, was there something before our universe? Has it always been there? This is saying that there was something, but again, did this something have a beginning? Ultimately, if you keep saying no, you're endorsing an eternal universe, which doesn't work, as we just saw. Therefore, an atheist ultimately has to say that at one point or another, there was nothing, that the universe had to come from nothing. Well, sometimes when atheists say this, you get to ask a few questions. What do they mean by nothing? Was it really actually nothing? Either it was or it wasn't. Some atheists will say the universe came from nothing, but then you press them on the point and they'll say, well, it was really a quantum field. That's where the universe came from. Well, a quantum field isn't actually nothing, is it? Well, they'll say the universe came from empty space. There was a fluctuation in empty space and up popped the Big Bang. Well, that doesn't work either because according to physics, empty space is actually something. As this secular cosmologist said, a more fundamental problem is that this scenario, this universe from empty space idea, does not really explain the origin of the universe. A quantum fluctuation of the vacuum of empty space assumes that there was a vacuum of some pre-existing space. And we now know that vacuum is very different from nothing. Vacuum or empty space has energy and tension, according to relativity. It can bend and warp, so it is unquestionably something. And as another very prominent cosmologist said, from the point of view of general relativity, empty space is unambiguously something. According to general relativity, space is not a passive background, but instead a flexible medium that can bend, twist, and flex. A proposal that the universe was created from empty space seems no more fundamental than a proposal that the universe was spawned by a piece of rubber. It might be true, but one would still want to ask where the piece of rubber came from. That's Alan Guth, by the way, probably the most prominent cosmologist in the country. He's the inventor of inflation theory, if you know what that means. My point, though, is that when an atheist says the universe came from nothing, but then you press him on the point and his version of nothing is empty space or a quantum field in empty space or whatever, that doesn't actually work because those things aren't nothing. Now, lately, the new excuse is quantum gravity is what the universe came from. Stephen Hawking has even said the laws of gravity and quantum theory allow universes to appear spontaneously from nothing. Lawrence Krauss, prominent atheist, has even said a quantum theory of gravity allows for the creation of space itself, where none existed before. So this is a very popular explanation. It's quite trendy now, but the thing is, if someone tells you this, if an atheist tries to give you this as a reason, press them on this point too, because it turns out physicists don't actually have a good theory of quantum gravity. Quantum theory of gravity does not exist in physics. They've been looking for one for a long time, but it's not there. Even Dr. Krauss itself, the person who wrote this best-selling book and says that a quantum theory of gravity explains the whole shebang, the ultimate mystery of our origins, admitted in an interview, I also don't have a quantum theory of gravity, so I can't tell you for certain how space comes into existence. So all the atheist stories about empty space and quantum fields and quantum theory of gravity, all the rest of it, are very hollow. Physics does not have justification for a universe coming from nothing. So we see then that that idea of coming from nothing that's not really nothing doesn't work, so therefore it had to come from actual nothing. But what would that imply? Well, that would imply that the universe ultimately had to create itself. Because if you're going to deny that there was anything there, that there was truly nothing, and then suddenly there was a universe, well, there was a creative event there, wasn't there? There was no universe, and then there was a universe, so the universe got created in a sense. And since there was nothing else outside the universe, nothing that existed before the universe, that means the universe had to create itself. But that doesn't work either, because self-creation is ultimately an absurd idea, right? Something can't create itself, can it? Because in order for a something to do anything, the something has to first exist, right? So self-creation would mean that something has to exist before it existed, which is nonsense. Now, sometimes if you talk about this to an atheist, he'll say, well, no. You're trying to tell me God did it. Well, God didn't have a cause, so I can just say the universe didn't have a cause, and that's no worse than what you're saying. Right, Mr. Christian? Well, no, it's not the same thing at all, because I'm saying God exists outside of space and time. He's transcendent to the universe. Therefore, it's not a problem for him to have created the universe. Whereas the atheist wants the universe to create itself, which, again, is nonsense. Also, the idea violates physics anyway. Let's talk about that for a minute. If you ever take a physics class, probably one of the first things you'll be taught is an idea called the conservation of matter and energy. The total amount of stuff and energy in the universe never changes. In fact, you may have heard the equation E equals mc squared. That shows us there's a relationship between matter and energy. E in the equation represents energy, m represents mass, and then c is the speed of light, a very large number. So that tells us that a little bit of mass, a little bit of stuff, represents a very large amount of energy. And we can convert the two back and forth. We can convert matter into energy and energy into matter. The most efficient way we know how to turn matter into energy is a nuclear explosion, because a little bit of stuff turns into a lot of energy. We can go the other way too. We can take a lot of energy and make a little bit of stuff. And we do that in particle accelerators. You get little chunks of matter whizzing around at close to the speed of light, smash them together, more material comes out of those collisions than went in. But you're not making matter out of nothing. What you're doing is converting its energy of motion, its kinetic energy, into physical material. So the idea then, there's a fixed amount of energy and matter in the universe. We can convert back and forth, but when you convert to one, you lose some of the other. The total combined amount in the universe never changes. You can never make either one out of nothing. We see this every day in our lives. Why is it that you have to eat food every day? Regardless of how difficult that process might sometimes be. Because your body needs energy, can't make it from nothing, so it has to get it from the chemical energy that's stored in the food, which requires you to actually get it in your mouth, but that's a separate story. Why do you get an electric bill every month? Because your appliances need electricity to run, can't make energy from nothing, has to get it from the electric company, which also can't make it from nothing. It has to get it from coal or gravitational potential energy in the form of water or whatever it is, and something like coal or natural gas or those things also can't get it from nothing. That's just stored sunlight, basically, and on it goes. In fact, you couldn't be watching this presentation if this fundamental principle of physics weren't true, because some of the principles of electronic circuit design are based on this principle, and of course we're using electronics just to have this talk here tonight. My point is, conservation laws are very, very fundamental in physics. In fact, as one of my textbooks says, conservation laws are the guiding principles of physics. These are absolute conservation laws. They are always obeyed. Unless you're an atheist cosmologist, because if you think about it, if you're an atheist cosmologist who believes that the universe came out of nothing, that violates this principle on the largest possible scale, right? You're saying that all the energy and matter in the entire universe sprang into existence out of nothing, in complete contradiction to this very fundamental, very well understood, very well confirmed and supported principle in physics. Now, an atheist cosmologist will sometimes tell you that actually it may seem that this principle is a problem for our model, but it's actually not, because the conservation of mass energy isn't really being violated by our atheistic cosmology. It may seem that nothing making everything is a problem, but that's not really a problem if everything is really nothing. Atheist cosmologists who deal with this problem get rid of it by modeling the universe in such a way that all the energy and matter in the universe added together makes up some number, we'll call it x. And then they model the universe mathematically so that the gravitational potential energy, which can be thought of as negative, also adds up to x. And if you have positive x and minus x, you get 0. Thus, they will say with a perfectly straight face, on a net basis, the Big Bang, or whatever atheist cosmology they're endorsing, didn't make anything because the universe isn't anything on a net basis. On a net basis, the universe is nothing. Stephen Hawking explained this. He said, the laws of physics demand the existence of something called negative energy. To get your head around this weird but crucial concept, let me draw a simple analogy. Imagine a man wants to build a hill on a flat piece of land. The hill will represent the universe. To make this hill, he digs a hole in the ground and uses that soil to build his hill. But of course, he's not just making a hill, he's also making a hole. In effect, a negative version of the hill. The stuff that was in the hole has now become the hill, and so it all perfectly balances out. This is the principle behind what happened right at the beginning of the universe. When the Big Bang produced a vast amount of positive energy, it simultaneously produced the same amount of negative energy. In this way, the positive and negative add up to 0, always. It's another law of nature. By the way, before I continue reading, I'll say they don't actually add up to 0 unless you invoke dark energy and a lot of other stuff that nobody's ever seen. So there's a lot of hand-waving to even make the statements that he's already said, but let's set that aside and move on. So what does that mean? It means that if the universe adds up to nothing, then you don't need a God to create it. You see his motive here, don't you? The universe is the ultimate free lunch. So you understand what he's saying. He's saying, okay, there's flat ground, a man digs a hole, well, he makes a hole and a hill. It's kind of the same. Positive hill, negative hole, cancels each other out. Universe works the same way. Who can see the problem in his analogy? Did the hole dig itself? Did the ground spontaneously split into a hill and hole? Or did you need somebody outside of the system who expended energy in order to make the system do that? Right? Professor Hawking is completely ignoring that part of his analogy, isn't he? I was giving a talk at a college one time, and a student said, someone had to make the lunch, which I thought was a good way of summing it up. If that example is a little too abstract for you, here's a more practical one. I once worked on a circuit, which is a very common design in loudspeaker systems, by the way, where one part of the circuit had to produce power to another part of the circuit, and it did so in the form of two wires, one of which had plus 40 volts on it and one of which had minus 40 volts on it. And if minus volts sound weird, don't worry, you can do that. So the whole purpose of the circuit was to make plus 40 volts, minus 40 volts on these two wires. Now, I could have argued, had I been thinking about this issue then, that on a net basis, my circuit produced 0 volts. It didn't actually do anything, right? Same logic as what Professor Hawking used, right? Yet somehow, when I pulled the plug out of the wall, the thing stopped working, and the voltages went away. My point is that the universe does not spontaneously diverge into precisely offsetting positive and negative energies unless there's an external agent of some kind that will do that and an external source of energy to be consumed while making it do that. And of course, an atheist cosmologist who's trying to explain the self-creation of the universe has neither of those to appeal to. Therefore, his model doesn't work. So we saw then that the idea that the universe came from something doesn't work because ultimately you're back to the eternal universe again if you take that to its logical conclusion. We said that it had to come from nothing, but then that would mean that it was self-creation, which violates physics, and that doesn't work either. So I hope I made the point by now that an atheistic approach to cosmology requires a violation of some very fundamental physics. Moving on from there, if you're going to be a consistent atheist and come up with a cosmology, ultimately you wind up doing something worse than just violating the laws of physics. Ultimately, your view is going to deny that laws of physics are even a valid thing to have. Now, before I explain that, I'll mention Christians don't have this problem because the biblical worldview actually affirms laws of physics. The book of Genesis says that while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Same point I made earlier, the Bible talks about the Lord being a God of order who created an orderly universe that will operate according to orderly patterns. And so as Christian physicists, and Christian scientists, well, Christian scientist, bad phrase. As Christians who are scientists, we can expect the universe to be orderly and go look for the patterns and find them. The atheist, however, not having this option, runs into a couple of problems. First, he ultimately, if he's a consistent atheist, which none of them are, winds up having to deny any reason for physics to be true in the first place, and then has to deny the laws of physics themselves. So let's talk about each one of those. According to an atheistic worldview, denying a creator, was there a cause for the universe? Well, let's see. Einstein's relativity is our best understanding of physics on a large scale. That tells us that space and time are intertwined. You may have heard the word space-time. That's what that means. So any atheistic cosmology that tries to have the universe come out of nothing has to have space-time coming out of nothing, which means, of course, there was no space-time before the universe popped into existence, which means, specifically, there was no time before this universe created itself. As Dr. Krauss said, if space spontaneously popped into existence, then so did time. Namely, time and space are both classical concepts that may have a limited domain of validity, and so the question of what was before the Big Bang may simply be a bad question because there was no before. Time didn't exist. So again, no time existed before the universe supposedly created itself. Well, that means there was no time for a cause before the universe, was there? Because a cause has to come before its effect, and if there was no before the universe, if there was no time, if there was no then back then the universe could not have had a cause for its self-creation, right? Because there was no time in which a cause could have happened. And secular scientists will admit this. As this author said, our universe may have resulted from a random quantum fluctuation. Well, we already saw how that doesn't work, but moving on. And this raises the remarkable possibility that the birth of our universe may have had no explicit cause. Remember, quantum fluctuations are profoundly random, so the normal backwards chain of cause and effect may get broken by the quantum fluctuation that triggered inflation, and I'm skipping some detail here. Key part, maybe there was no ultimate cause for the universe. It just happened. Universe just happened. As this cosmologist famously said, the universe is just one of those things that happens from time to time. Well, if the universe just happened, if there was no cause for it, if the universe was founded in randomness and chaos, well, there's a couple things we can realize from that. Number one, you've just denied all scientific inquiry in one fell swoop. Think about it. Every scientific discovery that's ever been made happened when someone said, something just happened that I didn't expect, and I need to go figure out why. Now, if everybody had this attitude about science, which is what an atheist ultimately should, is science going to progress or die? If Newton was sitting beneath his metaphorical tree there and saw the apple fall and said, just happened, then what further discoveries would he have made? That's not, of course, not what actually happened. What actually happened was he said, why did that fall? And then that got him thinking, and he formulated his laws of motion and so on. When people first noticed, milkmaids who get cowpox never get smallpox. Just happens. then you don't make medical progress, right? And on it goes. Again, my point, every scientific discovery starts with why did that just happen? The assumption that there is a reason why something happened, not that everything just happened. So first of all, this attitude is anti-science anyway. Second of all, when you apply it to the whole universe like this, it means the whole universe was born for no reason. Just created itself, it just happened. Now, if you actually believed that the universe formed out of randomness for no reason whatsoever, out of chaos, what right would you have to expect the universe to operate according to strict laws of physics afterwards? Is that consistent or inconsistent? Inconsistent, right? So if an atheist is really going to be an atheist and think it all the way through, he has no reason to expect laws of the universe to even be operating in the universe today, does he? Now, of course, if you talk to an atheist and mention that, he'll say, well, we know the universe operates according to laws of physics, so we can assume that they exist. Well, I agree that they exist, Mr. Atheist. The question is, how can they exist? Why should they exist? My worldview explains why they exist. Your worldview really consistently would say they don't. So we see that an atheistic cosmology denies any reason for physics to even be true anyway, but then it goes further and actually denies those laws of physics that we have. How does it do that? Well, let's talk about math for a minute. And I probably just lost half of the audience here, but that's okay, because this is actually very interesting. Mathematics has been called the language of physics. And if you ever take a physics class, you'll know that pretty much everything you ever write on a piece of paper is a mathematical equation of some sort, right? Math is how physics is expressed. The laws of physics are all mathematical equations. And if I said earlier physics is the fundamental science and tells us how the universe operates, and if math is the language of physics, then math is really the language of the universe, isn't it? Now, one of the Psalms talks about there being no speech or language where the voice isn't heard, but the glory of God goes all throughout. The Bible talks about a universal language, in a sense, being built into the cosmos. Now, I'm not saying the Bible's talking about math specifically, but I am saying that mathematics is consistent with that idea. And in fact, even some secular thinkers are saying math is so fundamental to physical reality that, as this entire book from a secular cosmologist says, our universe is mathematics. Not merely that mathematics describes the universe, but that when you look at the universe and our most fundamental understanding of quantum mechanics and so on, they fit the definition of mathematical structures. This author, secular guy, not a Christian, argues that the universe, like I said, manifested mathematics. Now, him not being a Christian means he denies things like spirit and consciousness, so he's wrong in that regard, doesn't go far enough. But insofar as he goes, I think it's a very intriguing thing. And to further reinforce this a little bit, we don't realize sitting here listening to this talk and sitting in this room how mathematical this environment is. The air you're breathing right now, going in and out of your lungs, is obeying the mathematical laws of statistical mechanics. The blood flowing in your veins is obeying the mathematics of fluid dynamics. Your very life is intertwined with mathematical behavior. Now, as Christians, we can say math is a real thing because the Bible uses mathematical concepts. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth. That means there is such a thing as the number 6, right? So as Christians, we can affirm mathematics is real, we can go discover it, we can go work it out. Atheists, however, don't have that foundation for mathematics, so they have to find a different one. And if you look at the history of this, up until the Enlightenment, more or less, people understood math was something God had built into the universe, and it's our privilege and joy to go discover it. Since the Enlightenment, most people don't want there to be a God anymore, so what then is mathematics? It's no longer something God built into the universe. It's no longer something we discover. Instead, it's something we invent. Among secular thinkers now, most would say mathematics isn't discovered, it's invented. It's just a fun mental game that mathematicians and scientists play. It's an art form kind of like poetry or music, just another form of human creative expression. As this author said, mathematics is the most original creation of the human spirit. This author says the mathematician is entirely free within the limits of his imagination to construct whatever worlds he pleases. He's not thereby discovering the fundamental principles of the universe, nor becoming acquainted with the ideas of God. Well, if you're going to be an atheist and think that, where does that take you? Well, as this author said, numbers must be free creations of the human mind. Okay, so 2 and 2 no longer equal 4, absolutely. Because 2 is just something we made up, that when added to itself, we defined it as something that produces 4. But you could just as easily define it as something that when added to itself produces the square root of 37, and that would be equally valid, according to this idea. As this author said, mathematics is a body of knowledge, but it contains no truths. Well, that would be the implication of atheism, yes, but does that match the world around us? No, it does not. Earlier I showed you these 4 equations here as an example of mathematics. These specifically are Maxwell's equations of electromagnetic theory. Specifically, James Clerk Maxwell in the year 1873 wrote a 2-volume book where he summarized everything that was understood of static electricity, alternating current, magnetism, a bunch of other phenomena, all into one mathematical framework. James Clerk Maxwell was a brilliant scientist, by the way, far ahead of his time in many ways, made several major discoveries, each of which would have been a life career goal for other people. He was also a very ardent Christian, by the way, and was not a believer in evolution, denied Darwin's work. But when he published his work in 1873, he was so far ahead of his time, his colleagues didn't even understand what he was talking about. It took 10 years for George Francis Fitzgerald to even understand some of the implications and said, you know, if Maxwell's right, he published 2 papers on this, if Maxwell's right, we should see energy loss as alternating currents go through a wire. We should see the current lose energy into the surrounding medium. And then 5 years later, Heinrich Hertz, in a famous experiment, verified that that loss was taking place. And we now call that radiation of energy radio waves. Now, are radio waves real things? If you have a cell phone in your pocket, you've got to say yes, right? Because that's how they work. Have radio waves always been real things since Heinrich Hertz verified they existed? And I think we'd all say yes to that. Were they real things before Fitzgerald realized that the mathematics predicted them? Most would say yes, right? Okay, think about that. If Maxwell's equations are just some poems that Maxwell wrote, why is the universe obligated to obey Maxwell's poetry? Does that make sense? Let's ask a further question. Were radio waves real things before Maxwell wrote the mathematics that was later realized to have those implications? And we'd all say, yes, radio waves have always been real things. Okay, now if you're an atheist, you not only have to believe that the universe is obligated to obey human poetry, but that it can see into the future to know what poems humans are going to write so that it could therefore obey them. Does this make sense? Does the universe obey human poetry? I mean, I think the silliness of this is rather obvious. And even some secular thinkers have wrestled with this. Why the external world should obey the laws of logic, and why, in fact, science should even be possible, is not at all an easy question to answer. Well, it's very easy to answer. Just go read your Bible. This Nobel Prize winner in physics, again, not a Christian, said, "The miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. The enormous usefulness of mathematics and the natural sciences is something bordering on the mysterious, and there's no rational explanation for it." Ultimately, all atheism can offer is this: though devoid of truth, mathematics has given man miraculous power over nature. This is the greatest paradox in human thought. Think about this. So this is a good summation of where atheism must take you if you're actually going to take your atheism to its logical conclusion. That mathematics is devoid of truth. Well, if mathematics is devoid of truth, then mathematical equations are all devoid of truth, right? But the laws of physics are all mathematical equations. So the laws of physics are devoid of truth, and you've just denied all of science in one fell swoop. Bang, it's dead. Everybody see how that works? If you're going to be an atheist and really be an atheist and take it all the way to where it goes, you're going to wind up denying that laws of physics even exist, that they're just devoid of truth. An atheist would object, though, well, we know mathematics works and that it helps us comprehend the universe. Well, Mr. Atheist, I know it works. That's because the Bible's true. That's because there is a creator who created mathematics and built it into the universe, and that's why we can discover it. And I'll skip forward a little bit. The Bible says, thy word is truth. Scientists who proceed on that assumption have accomplished great things. Many people have noticed in history and asked the question, why is it that Europe colonized so much of the world? Well, they colonized so much of the world because they were technologically more advanced at that time than most of the rest of the world. Well, why was that the case? Why did the Europeans ultimately get so far ahead of so many other cultures? It's not that Europeans are inherently more intelligent. It's not a genetic thing. I mean, we're all people. Yet somehow Europeans wound up ahead in the technological game. In fact, a lot of other civilizations had a big advantage over Europe time-wise. The Chinese invented gunpowder, paper, movable type, the compass, a whole bunch of other things before anybody in Europe had thought of such things. India had the wealth and stability of society necessary to foster scientific enterprise, and they also invented zero in mathematics, which is a huge boost in our understanding of math. Islam made some advances in mathematics, yet science was stillborn all those other places and only really took off in Europe. Why is that? Because those scientists believed in the Bible. Now, not all of them were necessarily full-on Christians as we would define it theologically necessarily. A few of them had some odd ideas. I mean, there were some deists in there and some other things. But they all had a Christian, a biblical worldview. So they could assume, they could affirm that the universe had mathematics built into it, that there were such things as laws of physics, that man was capable of perceiving them, because the heavens declare the glory of God, right? That means we can perceive God's glory within it, and all the other necessary things that make science possible. As Johannes Kepler said, we see how God, like a human architect, approached the founding of the world according to order and rule and measured everything in such a manner. Johannes Kepler discovered the laws of orbital mechanics, by the way. He discovered the mathematics of how orbits work, which was in the foundation for Isaac Newton to discover physics. Did Kepler do that because he was such an ardent atheist and denied existence of God and therefore had all the massive evidence of science on his side? No, not at all. He said, "Let my name perish if only the name of God the Father is thereby elevated." So we see then, not only does atheistic cosmology, if you're going to be a consistent atheist, deny any reason for physics to be true, you also wind up denying the laws of physics themselves. They're just devoid of truth, right? So that was all to show that an atheist, if he's going to be consistent, must deny the laws of physics are valid. And now our final point, ultimately an atheist has to deny that the universe itself even exists anyway. We made an assumption earlier when talking about the creation of the universe that the universe exists today. Well, does it actually exist? Well, this is kind of a silly question, right? Maybe not. If you believe the Bible, then you can affirm that the universe exists because the heavens declare the glory of God, right? That means there are such things as heavens. In 6 days, the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is. Well, that means those things exist, right? Because God created them. It's the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter. Again, we can assume that the universe exists, that physics exists within it, and we can go discover those things. The logical conclusion of atheism, though, runs a bit differently. If you're going to be a consistent atheist, and I'm sorry I've said that phrase how many times tonight, this is where you wind up, ultimately, as explained by this article in the New York Times. It could be the weirdest and most embarrassing prediction in the history of cosmology, if not science. If true, it would mean that you yourself are more likely to be some momentary fluctuation in a field of matter and energy out in space than a person with a real past in an orderly star-spangled cosmos. Your memories and the world that you think you see around you are illusions. This bizarre picture is the outcome of a recent series of calculations that take some of the bedrock theories and discoveries of modern cosmology to the limit. The basic problem is that it's hard for nature to make a whole universe. It's much easier to make fragments of one, like planets, yourself in a spacesuit, or even, in the most absurd and troubling example, a naked brain floating in space. Nature tends to do its easiest from the standpoint of energy and probability, and so these fragments, in particular the brains, would appear far more frequently than real full-fledged universes, or than us, or they might be us. Alan Guth, a cosmologist at MIT, and I mentioned his name earlier, he's probably the most prominent cosmologist in the country, who agrees that this overabundance is absurd, pointed out that some calculations from his atheistic cosmology result in an infinite number of free-floating brains for every normal brain, making it, quote, these are his words, infinitely unlikely for us to be normal brains, unquote. So you think you're sitting here in this room and that you have a brain in your skull and that your skull is in a body and that you're sitting in chairs in this room, but no. Actually, you are just a brain floating who popped into existence a few seconds ago with all the molecules that happen to be arranged in such a way that you have memories, false memories, of your life from being a child up until a few seconds ago. You think you're hearing me talking right now, but you're not. That's all part of the illusion. And it's not even that you're a brain floating in the cosmos, because there is no cosmos. It's just you. You're it. Not that any of this matters anyway, because in a few more seconds you're going to dissolve back into the thermodynamic soup that you fluctuated out of, and so everything's utterly pointless anyway. Now, this sounds like a really silly idea, and that's because it is a very silly idea. But if you're going to be an atheist cosmologist who believes that something can pop out of nothing, the mathematics of that assumption don't produce the universe we live in. The mathematics of that assumption overwhelmingly, infinitely more likely, remember, produces this, that you are just a brain floating in space with nothing else. And the mathematics for this comes from the work of a scientist called Ludwig Boltzmann. Thus, this idea is called Boltzmann brains. And I know what you're wondering, I know what you're thinking, and the answer to your question is no. No, I'm not making this up. This is an actual problem in secular cosmology. This is a scientific paper, a paradox in the global description of the multiverse. As this says right here, the overwhelming majority of observers arise from quantum fluctuations, that being the paradox of Boltzmann brains. I like this title, Boltzmann brains and the scale factor, oops, that's not the one. Boltzmann brains and the scale factor cutoff measure of the multiverse. This one, a note on Boltzmann brains. I'm reading these for those of you sitting in back, can't read this. This is the one I like. Can the Higgs boson save us from the menace of the Boltzmann brains? This is actually in the cosmological journals. Now, who heard about this in Cosmos or science media, science magazines, the rest of it, right? No. This is not stuff cosmologists like to talk about for obvious reasons, right? This is rather embarrassing. That their models have to wrestle with avoiding Boltzmann brain domination. This one admits that their models produce an infinite number of Boltzmann brains, whereas there are zero likelihood for us to be ordinary observers. Got that? Infinitely likely that you alone are a Boltzmann brain. Zero likelihood of you being a person with an actual body sitting in this room. Boltzmann's brain, another paper. Return of the Boltzmann brains. On and on it goes. Now again, I had to dig deep in the cosmological literature to find this stuff. This is not something that is discussed very openly. And typically at this point, I would talk a little bit about the mathematics of how this works. I will skip that for now. If you're curious about why the math says this, by the way, come talk to me after, I'll explain. But it basically comes down to this. If you're going to be an atheist cosmologist, you have to believe something popped into existence out of nothing. But your choice is between something very unlikely. I mean, a brain popping out of nothing is obviously absurd. But as unlikely as that is, the universe having popped into existence, I should say the baby Big Bang universe, is infinitely unlikely. Therefore, we're infinitely more likely to be, I should say you are infinitely more likely to be only a brain. It's infinitely unlikely for us to be normal brains. For that's, therefore, atheism's logical conclusion. If you're going to believe the math of the model, which you would think they would, that's what they claim to believe in, right? They're scientific models. Then it's infinitely unlikely for us to be normal brains. Instead, you are a Boltzmann brain. An atheist would object, though, well, this is clearly absurd. No one believes we are Boltzmann brains. Well, that's true, Mr. Atheist. That's because the Bible is true. If your model is true, then it's infinitely unlikely for us to be normal brains, which means it's infinitely unlikely that the universe exists then, right? Because if you're only a brain with no universe, then atheism ultimately says it's infinitely unlikely that that universe exists. So when an atheist tries to use science, reason, logic, mathematics against the Christian worldview, he may think he has a great weapon, but that's only because he's being an inconsistent atheist and not a consistent one. Were he consistent, he would think through the implications of his model and realize that science are not a weapon for him. Science and math and such are not weapons that he can use against the Bible, and instead, the only weapons he has access to is this one. So ultimately, as we said, an atheistic approach to cosmology denies that the universe exists, which was the third of our three items there. So returning to atheism, who says all scientists should be militant atheists, well, he's ignoring the fact that this is atheism's logical conclusion. As this non-Christian physicist said, people take it for granted that the physical world is both ordered and intelligible. The underlying order in nature, the laws of physics, are simply accepted as given as brute facts. Nobody asks where they came from. At least they do not do so in polite company. But even the most atheistic scientist has to accept as an act of faith that the universe isn't absurd, that there's a rational basis to physical existence manifested as law-like order in nature that's at least partly comprehensible to us. So science can proceed only if the scientist adopts an essentially theological worldview. And again, this scientist is not a Christian. So those scientists who are atheists, don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying an atheist can't be a good scientist. There are many scientists, good scientists, who are atheists, but they aren't consistent atheists. They aren't acting as scientists consistent with their worldview, because that would be impossible. The only worldview consistent with science and the world we see around us is the biblical one, because the heavens declare the glory of God, and we see that manifested in many, many ways. That brings me to the end of my presentation tonight. If you are new to this sort of stuff and haven't heard me talk before, then I welcome you to, well, even if you have heard this before, I have an email newsletter that presents this perspective on things, specifically in astronomy. It's free. It only comes out right now a few times a year, so you're not going to get a ton of email from me. That's available on my website. And a lot of the evidential kind of material in this presentation, where I talked about planets, stars, a little bit of the Big Bang stuff, that was all excerpted from some DVDs that are available in the table and back. This one here talks about the origin of the planets in our solar system, which I mentioned just briefly with the planetesimals thing. The full presentation goes planet by planet through the solar system and shows how each one could not have formed according to the secular model. DVD number 2 in that series discusses the formation of stars and galaxies, evidence for design within our sun, the size of the universe and what that tells us about our creator, and a few other things. And then the third one, Our Created Universe, is specifically debunking the Big Bang cosmogony and the implications of it. This is my website if you'd like the email newsletter sign up, and it's been my privilege to talk to you this evening. Thank you.
All right, awesome. We're going to take up a brief offering. If I can get our ushers down here as they're approaching. Make checks out to Cedar Park if you would. All the money is earmarked to fund this specific program and pay our speaker honorariums. Let me remind everyone as we're getting ready to take our offering that Thomas Kendall will be here next month. There's some flyers that look like this on the table in the back. Feel free to stop by and pick some up to post those someplace or share some of those. Let me just send up the offering with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you so much for the program this evening and for Spike. And again, we ask you to bless him and his ministry. And Father, we just lift up Cedar Park to you and ask for your blessings on this church and the many ministries that it's involved in, Father. Cedar Park Christian Schools, that you would let it be known throughout the region and that you would bring many more kids, people who need to receive an education from the biblical worldview, Father. This church is very, very involved in these things, and we just ask that you bless Cedar Park and all of its many ministries, its staff and its leadership, Father, and the monies that are brought in this evening, Father. We specifically ask that you bless these funds and allow them to be used to spread the news of your creation to the world and the knowledge of your Son, Jesus Christ. Father, we just send this offering up to you in Christ's name. Amen. So I know we started a little bit late, and I want to specifically apologize for that. It was all my fault. So I rarely ever take responsibility for my own fault. But Spike has spoken for us a couple times before when we were meeting at 7 o'clock. And when we shifted to Wednesday night, we shifted to 6:30, and I apparently never communicated that with him. So he shows up here expecting a 7 o'clock program, and we had to rush him into place to speak at 6:30, putting all of our tech guys all in a rush as well too. And I know that if you have kids that you need to pick up, there's some people, but I thought the webcast is going to run, I think, still till 8:15. If you have to leave, that's fine. But I think there might be some that would love an opportunity to ask Spike a couple of questions, so I want to give that opportunity, if you will. So does anyone have a question they would like to ask? Okay. We want to keep it kind of brief because we are going a little bit over on our time, but we can take a couple of questions, and then I'll close this down.
Well, there's the Big Bang timeline. How old is the universe and the Earth, in your opinion? 13 billion?
According to which clock would be my answer.
Your clock.
And the answer would require an explanation.
Christian clock.
No, I'm talking about a physical clock. I'm not differentiating theological clocks. Einstein's relativity says time will flow differently at different places in the universe depending on how mass is distributed. And if the early universe had a center of mass and was sufficiently dense and then was pulled out into a larger volume, which the Bible would imply where it talks about God stretching out the heavens, then you would have time flowing at different rates at the center of the mass versus the outer part of it. Now, the Big Bang cosmology doesn't have any kind of time difference because it denies that there was a center of mass at the beginning. That's a philosophical assumption, though, which it's not an observation, it's an assumption. If we discard that assumption and say maybe the universe did have a center of mass, what would that have looked like? Then you can wind up with a universe where 6,000 years could have flowed according to a clock on Earth, whereas millions or billions of years could have flowed at a clock far removed from the Earth, and there are both valid measurements done in that local frame of reference. So an observer at different locations of the universe would have a different answer to the question of how much time had passed since the beginning, depending on where he was relative to the center of mass. And I just condensed a long explanation into a couple of sentences, so I'm not sure if that made sense to anybody. But that would be the answer to the question. I don't necessarily believe there's an absolute answer that would apply to the entire universe because of that implication of general relativity.
Yes, it seems to me that the atheist, what is his answer to, we believe that God created all that there is, including us, but it seems like a question of intelligence. Each of us is a universe in itself, an intelligent universe. And so what is the atheist's answer to what life is, actually, intelligent life? Like each of us is an intelligent life.
A lot of atheists would say that consciousness is an emergent phenomenon, that if matter gets arranged into a complicated enough arrangement, it becomes conscious on its own. Now, my answer would be show me that in the laboratory. A consistent atheist has to be a materialist, meaning that only that which is material is real. So a consistent atheist would deny the truth of spirit or consciousness and other things that go along with that. And Daniel Dennett has written books arguing that consciousness is an illusion. And he's not the only one. He's just one of the more famous ones to do so. So in answer to your question, a lot of them would just say that a lot of what we think we see is just an illusion anyway. So what they're saying is their answer is an illusion. Yes, Daniel Dennett wrote a book telling you that Daniel Dennett is not a conscious being. And he doesn't seem to realize the problem with that. But that's where the atheists have to wind up. Yes?
So with the whole Boltzmann brains thing, is that one brain popping out into nothing and then disappearing in a second, or multiple brains popping out into nothing at the same time, and that's all of us here? How does that...
Well, it would say that in an infinite eternal cosmos, there's ultimately going to be an infinite number of them happening, but each one, on its own is such an unlikely event. You're very unlikely to have more than one at any given moment. So we wouldn't in this room all be simultaneous Boltzmann brains. You would be the only one, and this whole room is your own personal illusion. Now, a gajillion years from now, another one might pop into existence, and its universe might be completely different. I mean, he might think he's Captain Kirk or Mr. Spock, or, whatever, just, make something up. So it doesn't deny that you could have more than one at a time, but even one of those is so unlikely, you're not likely to have more than one at a time. But the issue isn't so much how many Boltzmann brains are there. The issue is there's infinitely more likely for a Boltzmann brain or brains to exist than for a universe to have popped into existence the way the Big Bang model specifically requires. I should have said atheistic cosmologies in general have a Boltzmann brain problem. They would just say it's mathematically overwhelming that Boltzmann brain is the truth. Big Bang specifically as an atheist cosmology makes that worse and goes from mathematically overwhelming to infinitely more likely. So the atheistic cosmology on its own doesn't say infinitely, it just says overwhelming. The idea that there's an actual universe is absurd. But the Big Bang kind of seals the deal and says, no, infinite number of Boltzmann brains per ordinary universe, thus zero likelihood of ordinary, infinitely more likely Boltzmann. That's probably more detailed than you wanted, but okay. Yes?
What finally convinced you that Christianity was true?
A bunch of things. I didn't want it to be true, and so I was looking for a way out, and so I was going through every science I could think of. And I became a creationist first, and then a Christian afterward. And I often mention that when I talk because people often say, Christians are creationists because you have to be, because you believe in the Bible, and so the Bible requires you to put the blinders on and not see the evidence. Well, no, I was persuaded by evidence first. Now, the evidence isn't sufficient to make you a Christian, if you think about it, because just because you believe there's a creator doesn't tell you which one it was. So in addition to science, it also, I was greatly persuaded by evidence of the historicity of the Bible, that the transmission of the text, that we have accurate copies of what was originally written, that what it says is true, that there was a man 2,000 years ago in Judea who predicted his own death and resurrection and then did it 3 days later. All these are the things. If you look at if you ask the question how we know what we know, as applied to different areas, if you're going to deny that the resurrection happened, you have to deny that we can know anything about ancient history, because it's overwhelmingly the most well-documented event in ancient history. So, I'm an optimist. I like to believe we can know things about the past, and so I had to admit, yes, the resurrection's true. Yes, the Bible is an accurate, the one I have in my hand is a reliable copy of the documents written by the authors that long ago, and on it goes. So I can't answer your question specifically because there's a whole bunch of things, a bunch of different areas of science, and also archaeology, history, and all the rest of it. Yes?
What do you think is a good explanation for the Kobe satellite, the background radiation it measured?
Well, the Kobe, okay. There's radiation coming to the Earth from all points in space. That's what the question was about. The Big Bang actually predicted that there would be such radiation found, and when it was found, that was considered to be a great success for the Big Bang model and really brought it to prominence in secular circles and made it the dominant cosmology. The radiation, well, there's two questions. First of all, is it local or cosmic is one question. If it is cosmic, what is it? There have been some who questioned the cosmic nature of it and said it's a local effect only, and the argument is that if it were actually cosmic, we would see shadows cast by galaxies that are in between us and it, and we don't see those shadows. I haven't followed those arguments specifically, so I can't take a position on that one way or the other. I'm just mentioning that there are some who take that route. I'm willing to say it's cosmic, but that doesn't mean it came from a Big Bang. The shape of the curve and all the rest of it fits very well with it being an emission curve of some sort. There are several creationist ideas, because there's more than one proposed creationist cosmology. They account for the CMB in different ways. Some would say that there's matter out there actually radiating it. Others would attribute it to something else. So I could talk to you in more detail about it afterward if you like.
Yeah, Spock
Without getting
will be
into
around
detail
for a few more minutes if you want to stay and talk to him a little bit more.
Oh, we're done.
I'm going to have you close us out in a word of prayer.
Yes.
In just a second. So stop by and sign up for the email list if you haven't already. Again, Spike's got 3 DVDs that are on the table in the very back, which are widely regarded as some of the very best astronomy, creation astronomy DVDs that are available, if not the best. So really, really excellent works that he has done back there. Check the book tables. There's still coffee and some snacks in the back if you didn't know that already. So stop by there on your way back by. So would you close us in a word of prayer?
Yes. Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, for the freedom to gather in your name as we have done tonight. Help us, Father, to not take this freedom for granted as our country is going through uncertain times, Lord, and certainly does not seem to be turning toward you in any discernible way. Help all of us, Father, as individuals and as a community of believers, Father, worship you more, love you more, Lord, and see your glory better in all that we do, all that you have done around us, Lord, and most especially, Father, help us to understand the atoning work you've done through your Son and the great sacrifice that was made for us, Lord, beyond that which we can even understand. Just help us, Lord, to use this information and everything else you bring into our lives, Father. Just use it to draw us closer to yourself. In the name of your Son we pray. Amen.